The attempt video was a little longer than I had anticipated, so I'm going to split up conspiracy and solicitation, make 2 short videos. So let's jump in and talk about conspiracy. As we discussed with attempt, planning an offense doesn't constitute an attempt to the offense, but it may constitute conspiracy. If a defendant commits a crime they plan, they can get a charge with a charge of conspiracy and be charged with the actual offense that they committed. And this happens all the time. So let's jump on in here. The basic gist of conspiracy is that it punishes defendants for agreeing to commit a criminal offense. And it's possible that the defendant never actually commits the offense planned. He could still be charged with conspiracy. We'll do some examples in a little bit. I want to get some more rules out here. Under the common law, there was no conspiracy law. I used merged with the crime. If you've planned a crime and then committed the crime, it is you're charged with the crime. Same thing with somebody who conspires to commit the crime. It merges with. In the modern view is it's strictly statutory. It's created by statute. Both the states, all of the states, and the federal government have a conspiracy type law relative to all crimes. All crimes have a conspiracy. Well, conspiracy is a crime, but you can conspire to commit, and then you plug in the crime. And like all offenses, you need a criminal act, you need a criminal intent, and the criminal act in conspiracy is the agreement. The agreement to commit a criminal act. Doesn't have to be in writing, doesn't have to be formal, doesn't have to be fancy. You just need an agreement. In most states and in the feds, you also need some overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. The act doesn't have to be criminal. It just needs to be some act that moves the direction of the crime. Like an example could be somebody renting a van or getting a ladder. There was going to be, robberies, a neighborhood hitting a group, criminals who conspired to rob a neighborhood, somebody getting a van or agreeing to get a van to help move it along. Criminal intent, the mens rea, it has to be intentional, purposely, intentional, knowingly. You knowingly agree, you knowingly do the overt act. If you're in a jurisdiction that requires an overt act, New York State is a state that requires an overt act, so does the Model Penal Code and the states that follow, that are governed by the Model Penal Code. So you have, first, the defendant must agree or must intend to agree. The defendant must intend to agree with someone. Merely saying, yeah, I agree with you, or approving or seeking another's participation in a criminal purpose, that's not enough for the act. You must intend to agree with somebody. Second, the defendant must intend to commit the offense that is the object of the conspiracy. And the defendant must, it's not necessarily that defendant that is going to commit it, but understands that it will be committed. Either the defendant must intend that the group, or at least one member of the group, will commit all of the elements of the crime. In a conspiracy, when we say we have an agreement, you need 2 people. You don't have an agreement with just yourself. Defendant. So there's always at least 2 people involved. Okay? So let's look at some examples. Tom and Linda, Tom and Dave run into Linda at a bar. They have a few drinks and then decide to walk to a different bar nearby. While they walk along, Tom suggests a shortcut through an alley. Linda and Dave agree. Once they are in the alley, Tom grabs Linda and rapes her. While Tom is raping Linda, Dave pulls a garbage can in front of them so that no one can see from the street what Tom is doing. Did Tom and Dave conspire to rape Linda? The question is, let's start with, is there an agreement? There's no agreement. There's no discussion that Tom and Dave are having to decide to go to bars and solicit women and rape them. There's no agreement here. What do we have here? We have we have Tom, the principal, committing the crime of rape. And what do we have Dave doing? Dave's furthering that crime by moving garbage cans in front of what's going on. So Dave is what? An accomplice. So in this scenario, we do not have conspiracy. We have a flat-out crime being committed and someone being a accessory. Accomplice. Being an accomplice. Let's try a couple other ones. So Heather and Penny are having lunch at the Brass Hale, a posh watering hole for the upscale and trendy. Bemoaning the high price of the cocaine they consume in rather large quantities and the resulting crimp in their lifestyle, Heather turns to Penny and says, "Why don't we sell the stuff ourselves? That way we can make enough money to buy and use as much as we want and have enough money left over to indulge ourselves." Penny, sipping her champagne, says, "That is a great idea. Let's do it. I know where we can get crack cocaine in volume and on credit. I will call my friend tomorrow and make arrangements." They toast to their new business venture. Is this conspiracy? They're in agreement to commit a criminal act. There is. The next question is criminal intent. Is there criminal intent here? Purposely, knowingly, must intend to agree with someone. That's what's happening here. And if you're in a state that doesn't require an overt act, that is a conspiracy. Now you might be thinking, well, how the heck is someone going to catch them? Highly unlikely under this example. I'll tell you how in some cases this comes up. But let's go through some more examples first. The next day, Penny calls Rachel, her cocaine supplier, on the telephone to arrange for the purchase of a large amount of cocaine on credit, but Rachel is not there. Is this an overt act? Would this constitute an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy? Like I said, the act doesn't have to be criminal. Making a telephone call in furtherance of the crime could technically be considered an overt act. So you can see how this conspiracy is could lead to some interesting charges. Let's try. I thought I had another one here. Actually, I'm just going to move to my ones that I don't have anymore on the screen. But I want to point out that, like accomplice liability, like being an accomplice, I had asked you the question about what happens if the principal is never charged. Does the accomplice still get charged? Yes, they do, right? It's a recap. But this is very similar. Not everyone needs to be charged, and one can be acquitted of a charge and another not. One of the co-conspirators can be arrested. Also, not every co-conspirator needs to know about the other. This whole concept of conspiracy has the target is drug rings, the mafia, the mob, the higher ups. There's like mob rings and drug rings are like spokes in a wheel. They all kind of have to connect with each other to make things happen. So even though you might be the high up mob boss, you're working with other people and agreeing with other people to make crimes happen. So that's where we see conspiracy a lot, especially in the federal government in stalling drug trafficking. It happened. It's here. It's in the North Country. It happens because we have the interstate from New York City to Montreal, and there's a lot of trafficking. And while there's the bigwigs that are at the top of the food chain, the people who are getting caught are the folks that are driving over the border and into New York State or out of the United States into Canada. They call those folks mules. They get caught. They have a trunk full of whatever the drugs may be. It could be a wide range, and they are the ones that get picked off and prosecuted. And of course, the FBI makes all sorts of, hey, we'll go light on you. You need to tell us who your people are. And they may not know. They'll be like, well, this guy asked me if I do it, and they're going to pay me a few $100, and I need the money. They don't know who's up and down the chain. They only can get so much information. They, meaning law enforcement, only get so much information. So that's how this conspiracy normally plays. Is there conspiracies for other things? Oh, yeah. If there's a group of people who are going to jump the enemy of another one, they all get together and wait together. They can conspire to assault. So conspiracy is a little less than attempt, if you think that way. We have a few more rules here we have to flesh out relative to conspiracy. The Pinkerton rule. It's actually named after a case, Pinkerton versus the United States, because it was an appeal. Versus, if it starts in the trial court, it's the United States versus Pinkerton. Pinkerton found guilty and appealed. That's why his name is first. Pinkerton rule. Individuals who enter into a conspiracy are criminally responsible for every reasonable, foreseeable crime committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. Every reasonable, foreseeable crime. Is that fair? If you think of it in the context of a mob ring, the mafia, if some low-level worker bee is the one committing the crimes, and the feds want to catch, or the government wants to catch the higher-ups, it makes sense to have every single co-conspirator, whether they know about it or not know about it. If you're the mastermind, you're the sophistication at the top of the chain, and all your folks are running and doing what they're doing. So if the crime is reasonably foreseeable in furtherance of the conspiracy to run the drug cartel, to run the trafficking operation, then every crime you're going to be responsible for. And if you Google any of I like using the crime bosses, because this is where this conspiracy rule kind of really stems from. You can see, like John Gotti, so many counts of conspiracy to do A, B, C. So that's, make sure you know, with regards to every crime that's reasonably foreseeable, and a conspiracy can get you on the hook. Now, how is foreseeability determined? Well, you got to factor in the degree of the defendant and their involvement. We talking about John Gotti, crime boss? Their degree of involvement is quite high. Are we talking about the individual that I just spoke about, the mule, the driver of the drugs to get from A to B? A lot less. A lot less. Next, so you want to consider, one, is the crime foreseeable to further this conspiracy? And what degree? What degree is the defendant involved in this conspiracy? We have the Wharton's Rule, and this is a criminal offense that requires two parties. Okay? There's a handful of them. A criminal offense that requires two parties cannot be the object of a conspiracy that consists of two people. Prostitution, right? Two people. You need a John and you need a prostitute. They can't conspire to commit prostitution. It doesn't count if it's a crime that requires two people. A buyer and a seller in a drug transaction generally cannot be charged because you need two parties to have a criminal sale of a controlled substance. That's what it's called in New York. However, the drug seller can have a conspiracy with his supplier, and that supplier can have a conspiracy with the supplier up above. And if you can see, you can make this chain go all the way up the ladder, and the seller's transaction with the buyer can get the top guy on the hook for selling drugs, this particular charge, and conspiracy to commit this charge. Okay? So, for the Wharton's rule, you have to remember that if a criminal offense requires two parties, then they cannot be subject to a conspiracy. Renunciation or abandonment, very similar to the one we saw in attempt. It does exist here in conspiracy. There are a couple rules regarding that. They have to completely and voluntarily get out, number one. And number two, they have to prevent the accomplishment of the crime. So they need those two things in order to get out of conspiracy. Because once you start your once you've conspired, let's say you're the person who said you'd get the ladder. I'll get the ladder so we can climb up into the second floor windows and rob the neighborhood with this group of people I conspired with. So you get the ladder and you give them to the group, and then a few days later you're like, I went out. Well, you already did your part. And because you only supplied the ladder, and let's say you leave and they still do it, you're still part of the conspiracy. You may not get charged with the theft, but you're certainly going to get the conspiracy. So Lisa, Jane, and Mark learn that Lisa's elderly uncle keeps his life savings under his mattress. They agree to break into his home, kill him, and take the money. Lisa buys a gun and delivers it to Mark. Lisa, on her way to meet Mark and Jane at her uncle's home, is overcome with guilt and fond memories of her uncle. She decides she cannot go through with the plan. Instead, she catches a plane to San Francisco. Shortly after, Mark and Jane break into the uncle's house, kill him, and steal money. Can Lisa be arrested for conspiracy, or did she renunciate? Did she completely, voluntarily renounce her conspiracy? Well, she really didn't tell anybody. She just didn't show up. But did she prevent the crime? Nope. So she is still on the hook. She is still on the hook. Conspiracy grades. Again, when I say grades, like level of seriousness of the crime, it's going to depend from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, it will always be a lesser offense than the actual crime, so it'll be a lesser degree. In New York, we have a misdemeanor level conspiracy all the way up to an A, Class A felony, which is the highest level. And that level involves some serious drug trafficking charges. Conspired to sell and distribute quite a significant amount of cocaine would get a conspiracy, even if you're not the one who actually does the selling of it. If you just happen to be the passerby, the someone who gets something in, or maybe it's like, hey, I'll get you some people where you can sell the drugs to, whatever role. And when you read about these big drug busts in the newspaper, if you're from the St. Lawrence County area, there was, in the last 2-3 years, there were some big drug busts. They picked up over 100 people both times, and they were from all over the state. And I represented an individual from Cortland. He never even stepped foot in St. Lawrence County. He didn't even know where the St. Lawrence County was until the sheriff went to pick him up and had to drive him up here, and he sat in jail. But he was just making some phone calls. He knew people, and the law enforcement drug task force had a warrant and was listening to. This is how they do it. They listen in to phone calls. They get tipped off. It's usually from some sort of confidential informant, and they're able to get a warrant. Maybe you learned about warrants in criminal procedure. They get a warrant so they can tap phones, and now they're listening in to all of these conversations, and that's where the conspiracy comes in that situation. Okay? I think that's going to wrap it up here. We'll do... Oh, actually, I do want to talk about one more thing while we're here. I alluded to it. New York and some New York laws and federal statute, but I want to point out racketeering. The Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act, RICO, is the federal statute. Even though they tie in conspiracy for other things, but this was the big statute that Rudy Giuliani, when he was an awesome prosecutor in the 80s, he used this newly passed act to take down most of the mob families. And if you're into that sort of thing, there are a lot of movies and things documentaries on Netflix regards to how he was able to do that. So that's a common conspiracy statute. And we are going to move on to solicitation.